Hello and welcome to Module 7 in our Django series. This module is going to focus on Django forms, and this session is part 1 of 3 for this module. Before we get down to talking about the Forms API, let's understand the need for forms. Now, unless your website is going to focus solely on displaying or publishing content, you will require user input and therefore the need for Django forms. Now, many of you would have worked with HTML forms, and as you may know, HTML forms are a collection of elements that allow users to input text, select an option, manipulate objects, etc. The information entered by the user needs to be sent back to the server, and therefore the form needs to state the where and how. Where to indicate the URL to which this information needs to be sent, and the how to indicate the HTTP method to use to send this information back to the server. We will be talking about the two HTTP methods, get and post, that could be used for this purpose. We'll do that shortly. But now back to forms and elements. You may recall the login form for Django admin that we have worked with in earlier sessions. This form has input elements like username, which is an input element of text type. We have the password input element, which is of type password. We have the login input element, which is of type submit. The where for this login form or the URL is /admin/, and the how, as in the HTTP method used, is the post method. Why the login form does not use the get method, we'll come to shortly. But now let's talk about the two HTTP methods, get and post. The get method takes as input data in string format. The output from this method is a composed URL, which consists of the address to which data is to be sent, and if there is any data, that data along with its keys and values. In short, data sent through the get method or the get request is appended to the URL. Now talking about the post method, this method takes as input from the browser form data. This data is encoded for transmission, sent to the server generates a response and sends that response back to the browser. Now let's compare and contrast get and post. The get method is used to retrieve data from the server. It could be used to send data to the server, but then of course the data, as we know, is going to be included in the URL. Also remember that the get request is going to remain in browser history, and if we send data using the get request, that data is also going to reflect in browser history, which makes the get method less secure. In addition, the get request is limited to the max size allowed for a URL, and on most popular browsers, the max size that works well is 2 KB or 2000 characters. Talking about the post method now, the post method is used to send data to the server. The data is not appended to the URL, but rather sent through the body of the post request. The post request does not remain in browser history, therefore is more secure. It's also not limited to the size of the URL because it's not sent through the URL. It's rather dependent on the server used, and we can configure the size of the post request through the server settings. Now let's discuss when the post method will be used and when the get method will be used. The post method will be used for requests that require changes to be made in the database on the server, and also with password forms. What happens then if we use the get method with password forms could be a question. Well, remember with the get method, the data is going with the URL that is appended to the URL. And if it is a password, then the password is going to appear in the URL. It's also going to appear in browser history as well as in server logs, and all in plain readable text. And that's a big security risk. So when is a get method used then? The get method is used, for example, like we saw on the last slide, to fetch a resource from the server, meaning for requests that do not change system state. Right? So for example, for a web search form. Now remember also that the get request is limited to the max size allowed for a URL, which is 2000 characters. And although we can use the get method to send data to the server, it is not suitable for sending large amounts of data as well as images. The get method should never be used with admin forms simply because the user request could be mimicked to gain access to sensitive parts of our system. In short, the get method with the admin form implies security risk. Now, talking about risks, let's talk about cross-site request forgeries. We have addressed this very briefly in earlier sessions, if you recall, but let's understand what happens during this attack. So if the user is logged into your site using his or her credentials and simultaneously visits a malicious website, this malicious website could, through the user's browser, send a request to your server. The server believes that the request is coming from the user. Why? Because the request comes with user cookies. Now, depending on the forms on your site that are vulnerable to attack, this attack could result in either logging the user, who is now the victim, out of your site. The victim's site preferences could be changed. And worse than that, funds could be transferred to another user's account. Also remember that cross-site request forgeries could be based on IP address. And these could result in an anonymous comment being posted, and that is shown as coming from the user's IP address. Also, settings on a device like a wireless router or a modem could be modified. In order to avoid these kinds of attacks, it's best to use a post method coupled with Django CSRF protection to control access. Now let's talk about the role of Django in forms. As we know, when working with forms, we need to write HTML for the forms, we need to validate and clean up form data, we need to repost the forms with error messages for any invalid data. We also need to save the data or pass it on for further processing, and then of course respond to the user to indicate success. Now Django takes over a lot of this work, making our life easier. For example, Django will prepare the data for rendering, create HTML forms for the data, process the submitted forms. Now we could write the code for all of this, but using Django is absolutely not necessary. At the heart of the Django Forms API lies the form class. And just as with a model, we have the model class fields mapping to database table fields. With the form, we have the form class fields mapping to HTML form input elements. Also, just as with the model, we have the model class describing the structure of an object. With the form, we have the form class describing the form layout. Now let's look at how the form handling system works. The process begins with a request from the browser coming in. That's the form page. A check is done to see if this is the first request to the URL. If it is, a default form is created and then sent for the user to input data. And then again, a check is done to see if this is the first request. At this point, it is not. The data then is validated. A check is done to see if the data is valid. If it is, then the required action is performed. The user is redirected to another URL indicating success. If, on the other hand, the data is found to be invalid, then the data that the user has input, as well as error messages, are then sent back to the user for modification and rectification of these errors. And again, the process begins. Now, it's important to remember that at the point where the default form is created, this form is an empty form or a form with default values. There's been no user input yet, and this form is referred to as an unbound form. The moment the user has input data, although there could be invalid data there, that form is still considered a bound form. So essentially, a bound form is one that is populated with data by the user. Now let's talk about the isValid method, which essentially takes care of form validation. So every form instance has an isValid method. This isValid method will check to see that all form fields have valid data. Once the fields are found to have valid data, isValid will return a true. Once isValid returns a true, we can then access the form's cleaned data attribute. Now, what is clean data? Essentially, it's data that is normalized to a consistent Python format. For example, we have the float field normalized to a Python float object, and we have the date field normalized to a Python datetime.date object. Let's see how the form can be rendered. Now, we could render the form either directly in a template or as an unordered list or as a div, as a table, or as a paragraph. To render the form directly in a template, we just enclose the form variable within double braces, just as we do with other variables. To render the form as an unordered list, we use form.as_ul, and this will create a series of line tags, one line tag per field, all automatically done by Django. To render the form as a div, we use form.as_div. To render the form as a table, we use form.as_table. And to render the form as a paragraph, we use form.as_p. Talking about built-in form field classes now, each of these form field classes is represented by a widget, right? So remember, we had model fields that we use, so we also have form fields. Talking about the first field, the Boolean field, this is represented by the widget checkbox input, which renders as input type equal to checkbox. So you see how the HTML is created then by Django. We have the char field form field class, which is represented by the text input widget, rendering as input type equal to text. We have the choice field form field class, represented by the select widget, rendering as select an option. We have the date field form field class, represented by date input widget, rendering as input type equal to text. We have the datetime field form field class, represented by the widget datetime input, rendering as input type equal to text. We have the decimal field form field class, represented by the number input widget and rendering as input type equal to number. We also have the email field form field class, which is represented by the email input widget, rendering as input type equal to email. And then we have the image field form field class, represented by the clearable file input widget, rendering as input type equal to file. Finally, we have integer field, a form field class, represented by number input widget and rendering as input type equal to number. So just to give you a small example here, if we have a form like this, note how this form inherits from the Django's forms.form, right? So we've got to import the forms module or the forms library. If we have a form field like this, we're using the char field form field class there, and therefore it's going to render as input type equal to text. We have another field here, and again we're using char field, but in brackets we have widget equal to forms.text area, and therefore this is going to render as text area. So I hope that's clear. Now let's talk about the arguments that we can use with form fields. We have required that we can use to ensure that the form field is not left blank. We can use label to give a human readable name to our form field, initial to assign an initial value to our form field, validators. A validator is a function that we can use. This function will take a value, and if the value does not meet certain criteria, will raise a validation error. And then we have has changed, which we can use to check if the data has changed from its initial value, right? Now coming to our templates, we've done base.html. We've also done principals message, our team, gallery, about, teacher detail. All we're left with now is the enrollment template. And this is where we're going to use Django forms. This ends our session for today. In the next session, we will write the view for enrollment as well as a template. So till then, take care. Bye.